Who said the unexamined life is not worth living? Was it someone ridiculing our cultural obsession with money, youth, power, and fame? Was it a critic of mass media denouncing the unending barrage of messages that tell us what to think and want? Or was it an opponent of weapons of mass destruction, warning us to take stock of where we're heading? Who said the unexamined life is not worth living? Plato's parable of the cave, written in the 4th century BC, is to this day a powerful portrayal of how philosophy works. The speaker is Plato's teacher, Socrates.
And now let me describe the human situation in a parable about ignorance and learning. Imagine there are men living at the bottom of an underground cave whose entrance is a long passageway that rises up through the ground to the light outside. Their heads are held by chains so that they must sit facing the back wall of the cave and cannot turn their heads to look up through the entrance behind them. At some distance behind them, up near the entrance to the cave, a fire is burning, and objects pass in front of the fire so that they cast their shadows on the back wall where the prisoners see the moving shadows projected as if on a screen.
And the person with whom Socrates is speaking, Glaucon, says, "Those are very strange prisoners, Socrates." And Socrates gives an answer that is just electrifying. He says, well, they're like us.
And you feel offended. You say, I'm not like that. In what sense is my condition like that? Well, Plato isn't saying we're necessarily stuck being like the prisoners in the cave. He's saying the state we're in can start out being like that of the prisoners in the cave, but we can do better.
Now imagine the prisoners were able to talk with each other. And suppose their voices echoed off the wall so that the voices seemed to be coming from their own shadows. Then wouldn't they talk and refer to these shadows as if the shadows were real? For the prisoners, reality would consist of nothing but the shadows.
Now, the obvious thing to think of if you're explaining this to a modern audience, of course, is TV. Now, it's not that there's anything wrong with watching TV, but there is something going wrong if you think that TV shows you the way things really are. And that's what the cave is about.
The chains are customary ways of thinking about the world and thinking about our situation. It's what we've accepted from our parents, accepted from the culture around us, from television, from the movies, from the novels that we read. All these assumptions we have about what the world is like.
But next imagine that one of the prisoners was freed from his chains. Suppose he was suddenly forced to stand up and turn around toward the entrance of the cave, and then forced to walk up toward the burning fire.
Plato thinks most people grow up and they're quite happy with the views they've acquired about things, and they don't like being made to think about them. But someday somebody makes them think about them. And this is turning round.
The movement would be painful, and the glare from the fire would blind him so that he would not see clearly the real objects whose shadows he used to watch. What would he think if someone explained that everything he had seen before was an illusion, and that now he was nearer to reality, and that his vision was actually clearer? his eyes would hurt, and the pain would make him turn away and try to escape back to things he could see more easily, convinced that they really were more real than the new things he was being shown.
What that is coming to see that a lot of your opinions are secondhand and picked up, and in some sense not really your opinions at all. And this is painful, having to think about why you think about your beliefs, the sources of your beliefs. You realize, well, I only think that because that's what I was taught at school, or my parents brought me up to think that, or something like that.
But suppose that once more someone takes him and drags him up the steep and rugged ascent from the cave and forces him out into the full light of the sun. Won't he suffer greatly and be furious at being dragged upward? As he approaches the light, his eyes will be dazzled, and he won't be able to see any of that world we ourselves call reality.
This is Plato's way of showing us that sort of going from being in the dark to being able to see is not an easy process. It's not an immediate process.
Little by little, he will have to get used to looking at the upper world. At first, he will see shadows on the ground best. Next, perhaps the reflections of men and other objects in water, and then maybe the objects themselves. After this, he would find it easier to gaze at the light of the moon and the stars in the night sky than to look at the daylight sun and its light. Last of all, he will be able to look at the sun and contemplate its nature, not as it appears reflected in water, but as it is in itself and in its own domain.
What for him is crucial about coming to have knowledge, and not just any old beliefs about something, is that you've thought about it for yourself. That you don't accept something on other people's authority, or because it seems obvious, or because you can just see it, or something like that, but because you have reflected about it and scrutinized it in the most rigorous possible philosophical way.
Finally, imagine that the released prisoner was taken from the light and brought back into the cave to his old seat. His eyes would be full of darkness. Now he would have to compete in discerning the shadows with the prisoners who had never left the cave, while his own eyes were still dim. Wouldn't he appear ridiculous? Men would say of him that he had gone up and had come back down with his eyesight ruined, and that it was better not even to think of ascending.
Well, somebody who's been out of the cave and goes down into the cave finds that his way of looking at the world is radically at odds with that of most people. It's not just that he comes to different conclusions, but he thinks about things differently. And people don't like this.
They think that this guy's a lunatic. They think he's crazy. He's talking about stuff the likes of which none of us have ever experienced. So whatever this little trip was that he took, it's ruined his mind. It's made him an idiot. And so they scorn him.
So philosophy is both very compelling and very hard. And so it isn't presented as something that's all enjoyable or giving you a happy time. It's something that once you've started, you have to do because it is, in its way, compelling. You can't go back to the lower stage because it no longer satisfies you.
How does a person get started in philosophy? Often it's a small thing, something that clicks and opens a path to who you are.
I think I was maybe 12 or 13, and I ran across this argument from Descartes about why a benevolent and all-powerful God does indeed exist, even though lots of bad stuff happens in the world. And he gave an argument to that effect. And so I thought, well, is that... First of all, I never thought about things in that way, how to square things, how to square all the suffering in the world with the existence of God. But it struck me as pretty important to work that out and figure out my own beliefs on that.
My father was determined that his 4 intelligent children should engage in interesting discussions over Sunday lunch. And what would tend to happen is that he would raise some issue which we'd start talking about, and when we began going over the boundaries of what he felt was respectable, he would weigh in and give us the truth with a capital T, at which point my elder sister would burst into tears and slam the door and go up to her bed, and I would simply clam up. The product of this was that once the meal was over, I would go off into the garden and mull over in my mind what I might have said if I'd been quicker on my feet. And I suppose from the beginning, as a result, I tended to react against dogmatism, to react against the bare assertion of general truths for which arguments weren't given. And from the beginning, therefore, I found myself pursuing and wanting to reconstruct for myself the arguments which serve as underpinning, or whatever you like to call it, of the points of view we adopt.
Well, when I was a kid, I used to muse about such questions as, what if I'm the only conscious being on the planet? Maybe the rest of it's all just puppetry or illusion. So I guess I discovered philosophy like many kids when I was a very little kid, but then when I got into college, I read Descartes as a freshman, and that hooked me completely. Descartes' Meditations and the problem of the mind. I thought, this is one wonderful problem. I'm going to work on this if I can.
Well, I started out as a math major in college, especially liking, I guess, the most philosophical parts of math, logic and set theory, the foundations of mathematics. And the other courses I most liked were literature courses, reading novels. And so, actually, philosophy was a way of doing math and English and calling them both the same subjects.
When I got to university, I discovered that there was this field, philosophy. There were no facts. I'd always hated things like history, where I had to learn a bunch of facts. In philosophy, it was all just arguing, thinking, reasoning. And so I took to it sort of like a duck to water.
What is philosophy? How is it related to other fields of thought? How is it different?
But in philosophy, you ask why. Why does the world have to be this way? How could the world be this way? What does it mean for the world to be this way? What does it mean for the world for this to be the case? You ask a few of those questions, you get to the deep foundational questions. And philosophy is just what lies at the bottom of it all.
Like, I mean, you're doing history, and somebody comes along and says to you, well, I mean, you're just given an account, but that's not an explanation. What would it mean to explain the French Revolution as against just describing it? And you say, I don't know, I haven't thought about that. What is the difference between explaining and describing? So you get deeper and deeper into that. And finally, you're into these really fundamental questions that we usually take for granted. And that's philosophy.
The scientist will ask, what is the cause of cancer? But the philosopher will ask, well, what's cause anyway? What is for something to be a cause? What kind of a phenomenon is a causal phenomenon? What's a causal relation?
Philosophy is that discipline which wrestles with problems that are still in a state of too much confusion for any self-respecting science to try to grapple with them. We're the junkyard of the sciences, if you like.
For me, it seems that the philosopher is, in Locke's great phrase, an under-laborer to the rest of human culture and human science. And our task is to try to understand what's going on in various areas, to abstract from the detailed knowledge that the participants have, and to try to create a framework which makes sense of a much broader array of things than any one individual investigator or any one individual participant can actually make sense of.
I think that the role of the political philosopher in contemporary societies is, first of all, to try to identify or tease out the assumptions, the conventions, the unreflected assumptions that inform our public life, our political debates, and our ordinary judgments about public affairs, and then to subject those assumptions to critical reflection.
Well, I think if you look at issues like abortion, euthanasia, war, animal rights, you can see that there are very strong passions aroused. People have these very strong positions, but often the arguments aren't particularly well thought out. And as I see it, philosophers perfectly well can adopt a particular position and argue for it, but their prime function is to clarify what the arguments are.
Sometimes I think people believe it's rather naive on my part, but I have a tremendous belief in the power of rational argument to improve public life and also personal life. So I think what's great about the Greek philosophers is that they didn't just take philosophy for granted, but they had to really show people why it was important.
I think that philosophy is, from Socrates on, has been concerned with thinking carefully about how to live. Now, it's been concerned with a lot of other stuff too already. Plato began to be fascinated in philosophy of mathematics, which apparently he took 10 years off at one time to learn the new geometry, which had a big influence on all his thought, theory of knowledge, metaphysics, and so on. But I think that while philosophy can't be exclusively about how to live, it can't be just narrowed to, say, ethics, that combination of an interest in how to live and an interest in reasoning carefully about it, bringing together these two things that seem so different, close reasoning and a concern with man's place in the universe, the meaning of it all, how to live. This has to remain part of philosophy.
What is a philosopher like? Often we think of philosophers as introspective, people who probe deeper and deeper into their own thoughts. But perhaps the most famous example of how to do philosophy was a person who loved to mix with people, Plato's teacher, Socrates.
What Socrates did was go around questioning people, trying to find out whether they understood things that they claimed to be able to understand. And it was a very revolutionary idea that of all things, could be what philosophy is. Because traditionally, philosophy had been seen as, you have a view of the world, often a very ambitious view, metaphysical view of the world, and you write it down.
Since Socrates wrote nothing down, we know him largely through the writings of his student Plato.
He calls himself, in Plato's Apology, a kind of gadfly, a stinging insect on the body politic.
He goes around talking to anybody, asking them what they think about a whole variety of everyday subjects. That's philosophy. That must have seemed like a really very striking idea. And that's, I think, why Socrates stayed as such a continuingly powerful figure. Because I think throughout the centuries, that has turned out to be the view of what philosophy is. That is the most powerful.
And it seems to me that the best philosophers I know, and certainly the best teachers, are the ones who are very much like that. I'm sure many of them would not like to picture themselves that way. But, you know, the talkativeness, the aggressiveness, the loving to just be with people, argue with people, talk to people, that's something special.
This is a man who had a conception of what human life was about, of what made a human life worthwhile. He said the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. This is what he did every day. He could do it whenever he could do it, with whomever he could do it. And so certainly as that's what got him into the trouble.
Socrates was accused of impiety, of undermining faith in the traditional gods, and corrupting the youth of Athens. During his trial before a jury of 500 Athenians, Socrates describes how he became involved in his quest.
Some of you know my good friend Chaerephon. Before he died, he went to Delphi and asked the religious oracle there to tell him who the wisest man in the world was. The oracle answered that there was no man wiser than Socrates. When I learned this, I asked myself, what can the God's oracle mean? For I knew I had no wisdom.
Out of respect for the oracle, Socrates sets out on a religious mission to find a truly wise person. He talks to politicians, poets, craftspeople. He asks about piety, love, justice. He discovers that he is the wisest in the ironic sense that he has no pretensions to wisdom, whereas others do. And he deflates these pretensions with a technique that has become known as the Socratic method.
Most people are very eager to tell you what they think. Socrates says, okay, tell me what you think. Then what Socrates does is he asks questions which are designed to bring out other things that the person thinks. And Socrates has this uncanny ability to ask the kind of questions which bring out other things which the individual thinks, but which conflict with that first stated opinion.
In the first book of Plato's Republic, the boastful character Thrasymachus argues that justice is whatever is in the interest of the rulers. Socrates pursues the point.
Now, we're both agreed that justice is interest of some sort, but you go on to say of the stronger. About this addition, I'm not so sure and must therefore question further.
Proceed.
First, tell me, do you admit that it is just for subjects to obey their rulers?
I do.
But are the rulers of states absolutely infallible, or are they sometimes liable to err?
To be sure, they are liable to err.
Then in making their laws, they may sometimes make them rightly and sometimes not?
True.
When they make them rightly, they make them agreeably to their interest. When they are mistaken, contrary to their interest. You admit that?
Yes.
And the laws which they make must be obeyed by their subjects, and that is what you call justice?
Doubtless.
Then justice, according to your argument, is not only obedience to the interest of the stronger, but the reverse.
What is it that you are saying?
Well, have we not admitted that the rulers may be mistaken about their own interest in what they command, and also that to obey them is justice?
Yes.
Then you must also have acknowledged justice not to be for the interest of the stronger, when the rulers unintentionally command things to be done which are to their own injury.
Yes, but...
Here we have this scruffy question asking. This person who comes, gets up into the faces of his interlocutors, and exposes all of the values by which they live their lives as filled with problems, as incoherent, as a conceptual mess. He must have been not only physically ugly, but extremely, extremely irritating. On the other hand, his unwavering interest in finding out what the right values would look like, and his ability to puncture the pretense of these phonies, I can imagine would make him also a terribly attractive figure.
Finally, much of Socrates' appeal stems from his refusal to compromise, even to save his own life. He concludes the defense at his trial.
And if you say to me, Socrates, we will let you go free, but only on condition that you stop your questioning, then I will reply, Men of Athens, I honor and love you, but I must obey God rather than you. And while I have life and strength, I will never stop doing philosophy, for my aim is to persuade you all, young and old alike, not to think about your lives or your properties, but first and foremost to care about your inner self. I tell you that wealth does not make you good within, but that from inner goodness comes wealth and every other benefit to man. This is my teaching, and if it corrupts youth, then I suppose I am their corrupter. To talk daily about what makes us good and to question myself and others is the greatest thing man can do. For the unexamined life is not worth living.
The jury voted 280 to 220 to convict Socrates. Later, he was held in loose confinement. His friends encouraged him to flee, but he refused on principle. And when the time came, he drank the hemlock that was given to him and died.
I think that it is important for there to be such a thing as public philosophy. I think the public philosopher forces us to deepen our examination of the issues. I think today, especially in the age of the soundbite, in the age when tremendously powerful forces are trying to turn reasoning about public issues into a mockery, into simple manipulation by the media. The example of another kind of thinking, of serious reflective thinking, even which goes all the way to metaphysics, is terribly important.
If we try to understand the value of philosophy by the values that govern or motivate other fields that are practical in their motivations, I think what we end up doing is we end up losing the intrinsic value of inquiry, the intrinsic value of wonder, the intrinsic value of asking questions and really wanting to pursue the answers and not being willing to take pat, standard, traditional, culturally given answers as the ultimate truth.
In physics, you don't read Newton. In philosophy, well, it incorporates its history. Philosophy is like this fixed four-dimensional object. In philosophers' minds, Plato is alive. What you're doing is taking part in trying to take part in a conversation where Plato's speech is there, Aristotle's reply, Augustine, Thomas, Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, and Kant, and you're trying to tack on the next bit of the conversation.
The Examined Life is a 26-part series for college credit. To purchase a video cassette or transcript of this program, call 626-796-7300 or visit us online